In just 9 seconds, the Senate chamber went from careful applause to complete, undeniable silence. It started like any other hearing. Lights, cameras, and rehearsed optimism. Then Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez stepped to the mic and, with calm confidence, praised China's environmental leadership. She called them a model of green commitment, and for a brief moment, it worked. Heads nodded, reporters scribbled, a narrative was forming. But across the table, J.D. Vance didn't flinch. He didn't interrupt. He simply waited. And when the room had quieted, he asked one question. Not a long-winded speech, not partisan fireworks, just a single sentence that shattered the illusion. That's when the air changed. You could hear it, the weight of something real pressing down on every shoulder. Even those who disagreed with him fell silent. Because sometimes the most explosive moments in politics don't sound like shouting, they sound like truth, whispered into a room that's forgotten how to listen. What you're about to hear didn't happen exactly this way, but the questions are real, the tensions are real. And the silence, that part, that's what truth often sounds like. This is a fictional retelling inspired by public figures and public moments, crafted not to reenact history, but to reveal what so many still feel beneath it. Stay with us. What follows is more than a story. It's a moment worth every second. The chandeliered ceiling of the Grand Palais shimmered with soft light as the cameras began to roll. Flags from 27 countries lined the marble perimeter of the Global Sustainability Forum, but all eyes were fixed on the woman walking calmly to the podium. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, fluent, charismatic, and unwavering, smiled as she adjusted the mic. She didn't need notes. Outside it was raining in Paris, but inside it felt like a coronation. With the rhythm of someone who had rehearsed with her heart more than her script, she opened with urgency. We are standing at a tipping point, not just of climate policy, but of climate morality. Heads nodded. While some nations stall behind corporate interests and outdated fears, others step forward. They act, they build, they lead. And then came the line that would divide a continent, then a country, then a chamber in Washington. China has not been perfect, but in this fight, they are a model of what commitment looks like. There was a pause, a flicker in the room, and then applause. Hesitant at first, but swelling. Loudest among the foreign delegates. Camera shutters clicked. Journalists typed the headline in real time. AOC, China is a model of green leadership. Somewhere near the back, an American ambassador looked sideways, expression unreadable. She continued with elegance, naming statistics about solar investments and decarbonization targets in Shanghai and Shenzhen. No mention of forced labor, no reference to coal plants quietly opening in rural provinces. But she wasn't there to litigate. She was there to inspire. And in that moment, she did. When her speech ended, the ovation was full and theatrical. A standing ovation, not from all, but from enough to be noticed. And then something strange happened. As she stepped off the podium, shaking hands with various dignitaries, an aide to the event staff motioned discreetly to her right. A man in a dark gray suit approached, polished, thin smile, wire-rimmed glasses. His lapel bore the subtle pin of a Chinese conglomerate few Americans would recognize by name, but every policymaker in Washington had seen in briefing reports. Solentech. They shook hands. A soft, practiced gesture. A camera flash caught the moment, not from the press pit, but from a delegate's phone 3 rows back. A single frame. Her hand, his hand. Smiles. Nothing spoken. And yet, something passed. She moved on. The room buzzed. Champagne was offered in the corner. A Japanese minister leaned into a German counterpart and whispered something about trade partnerships. Across the aisle, a South African journalist typed the word controversial into her lead, then deleted it. Meanwhile, the photo made its way quietly to a private WhatsApp group in Washington. A young staffer who had once interned on Capitol Hill screenshotted the image and sent it to a name she hadn't texted in 2 years. You'll want to see this. JD's not going to like it. Back inside the Palais, AOC stood near a window overlooking the Seine. Her eyes scanned the city like a strategist measuring a chessboard. She had no idea that within hours the clip of her speech would explode online, nor that a man in Ohio, far from the lights of Paris, would see it and sit in stunned silence, before rising to speak for a town she hadn't named, but had just defined. The applause in Paris was still echoing across newsrooms when, 6 time zones away, a grainy live stream lit up the wall of a rust-stained Union Hall in eastern Ohio. The projector flickered faintly, fighting against the humming fluorescent lights overhead. It wasn't a banquet room like the one AOC had just left. It was a hall built by hands now calloused or gone. A flag hung to the side. The coffee smelled burned. The chairs didn't match. But every eye in the room was glued to the screen. There she was, polished, passionate, clear. The speech was replaying on a local affiliate. The words rolled out like they had in Paris. But here they landed differently. China, a model of what commitment looks like. A few men leaned back in their chairs. Others didn't move at all. In the back, someone exhaled sharply. Not a laugh, not a cough. Just something between disbelief and disappointment. The camera cut to her standing ovation. One man crossed his arms. Another looked at the floor. Then came a whisper. Barely audible, but loud enough in a room that knew the weight of silence. My brother's job went to the place she's applauding. No one responded. They didn't need to. J.D. Vance, seated quietly at the side, stood up. He didn't take the microphone. He didn't need to. When he spoke, he didn't raise his voice. But the room still leaned forward. She called them green, he said, eyes locked on the screen. They called us obsolete. It wasn't the first time they'd heard a line like that, but something about who had said it this time and how made it land harder. J.D. paused. He glanced at the worn plaque behind the podium. Local 412, established 1947, then back at the screen. She calls it progress. We call it what happened when our lights went out. The room murmured, not loud but long, like something old had stirred. J.D. didn't pivot into politics. He didn't lecture. He talked about what it felt like to drive past the steel mill that now had weeds growing through the loading dock. About his cousin who trained 5 new hires at the plant, only to be laid off before the month ended because China dropped their export prices overnight. I don't care what they're building over there, he said. If it comes at the cost of what we built here, we have the right to ask questions, loudly. Someone clapped, not polite applause, just one solid smack of the hand. Then another joined, and then silence again. But this time, it wasn't bitter. It was waiting. J.D. looked out across the room. It wasn't full. No TV crews, no filtered lenses, just a half-lit room of men and women who remembered what it meant to be needed. We've got people in D.C. who speak fluent optimism, he said. But the last time I checked, we still measure loyalty in jobs, not slogans. The projector screen froze for a second, buffering. AOC's smile paused mid-sentence, eyes halfway to a blink. J.D. turned to the room. You know what the biggest difference is between Paris and here? No one answered. They still get invited to the table. The hall had emptied an hour earlier, but J.D. Vance remained behind. The projector was off. The chairs were stacked. The coffee had gone cold. Only the soft buzz of a vending machine filled the room now. He sat at a folding table with his phone in his hand and a bitter focus in his eyes. On screen, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez still stood frozen mid-sentence from the buffered clip. Her face, paused between gestures, hovered like a symbol, one that didn't belong here. Not anymore. J.D. stared at the screen for a long while before finally opening his notes app. He wasn't drafting a speech. He was building something sharper, something meant to slip past the noise and slice. He scrolled through his saved folders. One labeled China plant closures. Another, Xinjiang satellite footage. He clicked open one image, a 2023 satellite photo showing a massive coal-fired facility in Xinjiang province, the same province from which so much of the global green supply chain quietly flowed. Another image, taken just a year ago, showed black smoke curling into the sky above a solar manufacturing plant. He remembered the report. Forced labor concerns, zero transparency, international silence. His thumb hovered over the image. Then he began typing. Tweet 1. Today, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez stood in Paris and called China a model of climate commitment. Tweet 2. Here's a coal plant in Xinjiang they opened last year. One of more than 40 new fossil plants breaking ground while we close ours. Attached. Satellite image, time-stamped. Visible smog line. Tweet 3. This isn't commitment. This is camouflage. Tweet 4. Paris applauds. But we're the ones paying for it. He read it again. He didn't change a word. He didn't need to. It wasn't a scream. It was a cut. He hit post. Within minutes, the thread began to spread. First through his core base, then into libertarian circles, then into conservative media personalities who had been waiting for something this clear, this visceral. One retweet read, "This is how you fight back. JD just dropped the hammer." Another, "Some truths don't need editing, just courage." By nightfall, the thread had crossed 100,000 likes. Hashtags trended, hashtag green camouflage, hashtag Xinjiang coal, hashtag JD versus AOC. CNN mentioned it cautiously. Fox News put it on a banner headline. MSNBC raised contextual questions, but still showed the images. AOC's team responded with a statement about cherry-picked visuals and global complexity. But the room had already changed. The applause in Paris didn't sound quite as clean anymore, because now it had an echo, and in that echo were questions too sharp to ignore. In Columbus, a local paper ran the side-by-side images on the front page. In Youngstown, a retired welder printed the tweet and taped it to the wall of the diner where he took his morning coffee. Even in Washington, aides from both parties read it on their phones in elevators, silently noting the sudden shift in tone. Back in Ohio, J.D. Vance sat at his desk alone, the same look in his eyes that he had worn at the plant gates years ago. He wasn't finished, not even close. But he knew what had just happened. A line had been drawn, not in policy, not in rhetoric, but in public feeling. He looked back at the screen, refreshed the tweet thread, and saw one reply pinned near the top. "She spoke for the world. He spoke for us." JD locked the screen and leaned back. It had begun. By the next morning, JD was already on the road. The tweets had gone viral, the headlines had begun to turn, and TV segments were airing side-by-side shots of coal plants in Xinjiang and shuttered factories in Appalachia. But JD wasn't interested in what the anchors were saying. He was heading toward what they had stopped showing. A long stretch of blacktop carried him into Lyon County, Kentucky, the heart of a promise once made and quickly broken. 15 years ago, the Ridge Point solar plant had been billed as the flagship of America's green future. The ribbon cutting had drawn state officials, senators, even a celebrity or two. "Clean energy, clean jobs," the banners had said. Now the gates hung open. Rust lined the chain-link fence. One of the solar panels outside the security booth was cracked, like it had tried to catch the sun one last time and failed. JD stepped out of his truck and walked slowly toward the side loading dock, now welded shut. Graffiti marked the sidewall. Not vulgar, just worn. "You said we'd matter." The breeze pushed loose gravel across the empty lot. Not a soul in sight. He paused at the edge of the lot as a man approached from a red pickup across the street. Flannel sleeves rolled up, baseball cap faded from use, maybe mid-50s, maybe older. His boots looked like they hadn't been new in a decade. "You looking for the plant?" the man asked. JD nodded. "Used to be the pride of this town, right?" The man smirked without humor. "We didn't go green," he said. "We went ghost." JD let the words sit. There was nothing rehearsed about that line. It was what people said when they weren't trying to make a point, just trying to be honest. The man introduced himself as Randy. He used to handle intake on the south end of the facility. Said he trained 16 hires his first year. Said one of them was his own son. Then came the price crash, Randy added. Solar panels from overseas, pennies on the dollar, and ours couldn't compete unless you worked for free. Guess who could afford that? JD didn't have to answer. He already knew. He'd seen the import reports. Footage played in his mind like a documentary. Container ships full of clean energy, unloaded at ports with smiling press shots and net zero banners. But the fine print was always the same. Origin, China. Destination, everywhere. He stepped closer to the rusted gate. "We were underbid by a dictatorship," he said quietly. Randy raised an eyebrow, then nodded. Not with outrage, just weary agreement. Inside the factory, stripped wiring hung like vines. Most of the machines were gone, sold for parts. A cracked poster near the entrance still read, "Powering tomorrow today." JD pulled out his phone, took a few photos, but didn't post anything. Not yet. This wasn't for Twitter. This was for memory. "We were told we'd lead the world," Randy said as they turned back toward the lot. "Turns out we just handed them the map." JD reached for the driver's side door, then stopped. "How many folks from here still out of work?" Randy's voice was steady. "Almost all of them, but you won't see that on anyone's climate report." JD didn't say goodbye. He just nodded once, firm and low, then climbed back in the truck. As he pulled away, the Ridgepoint plant faded in the rear view, just steel bones and broken glass. But the words stayed behind like ghosts that hadn't finished speaking. By the time JD crossed the Kentucky border into Ohio, the clip had already gone viral. Not his this time, hers. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez appeared live on MSNBC, seated across from a carefully neutral anchor, her blazer sharp, her posture centered. The network had spent the day teasing the segment as a response to misinformation, but everyone knew what this really was, a counterstrike. The Chiron read, "AOC responds to JD Vance on China, climate and green lies." The anchor leaned forward. "Congresswoman, Senator Vance claims the U.S. is being outpaced not because we're falling behind, but because we're outsourcing integrity. What's your response?" AOC didn't blink. "We need to stop using working-class fear as a reason to slow down global progress." The quote hit social media before she'd finished the sentence, and it burned. "We're in a climate emergency, not a nostalgia contest," she continued. "Our future depends on innovation, on cooperation, on bold action, not on fear-stirring from people clinging to the past." Then came the move her team had clearly prepared. "If Senator Vance believes he has a better path forward, I invite him to join me at a climate justice town hall next week in New York. Let's have that conversation in front of the next generation, not the last one." The studio nodded. The host smiled. Twitter surged. But in Youngstown, Ohio, JD Vance was watching from the side of a small-town diner, the kind with burnt coffee and pie that never runs out. The waitress didn't say anything. She just refilled his mug and tilted her head at the screen. JD stirred his cup once, then reached for his phone. His staff had already sent him the clip. 3 versions, cropped, captioned, trending. He didn't respond immediately. He waited a few hours, let the storm build. Then just after midnight, he posted a video. No script, no graphics, no background music. Just JD in a flannel, seated at a plain oak desk with a steel mill painting on the wall behind him. "Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez wants a conversation," he began, voice steady. "I accept." A pause. "But not in a Manhattan auditorium with a curated audience and a 7-second delay. If we're going to talk about climate justice, then let's go where justice has been missing for years." He leaned forward. "Come to Youngstown. Come to a town where the only thing growing faster than unemployment is silence from Washington. Come to a factory floor that used to build the future until the future got shipped overseas." He closed simply. "Let's debate. Not in theory, but in reality." The clip wasn't flashy, but it moved, fast. By morning, it was the most watched video on political YouTube that week. A new hashtag emerged, hashtag debate in Youngstown. Fox News picked it up before noon. So did CNN. Even The View replayed the last sentence with raised eyebrows. In Brooklyn, AOC's team stayed silent for a few hours before confirming, "The Congresswoman is open to the location change, provided the conversation remains respectful and solutions-focused." JD's team responded with a single sentence. "We'll bring the chairs." You bring the answers. And just like that, the debate was on. Not in Paris, not New York, but in a town that had already lived through the question. The trucks rolled in before sunrise. Not factory trucks. Those had stopped coming years ago. These were satellite vans, camera crews, producers scanning for the right lighting angles on weathered brick walls. National media had descended on Youngstown, Ohio, like it was the center of gravity. For one night, it was. The Union Hall stood at the edge of town, flanked by shuttered shops and a mural that had faded in the sun but still read, "Built by hands, broken by silence." Inside, folding chairs were arranged in tight rows, facing a modest stage draped with two flags, one American, one Union blue. There were no velvet ropes, no red carpets, just polished linoleum, worn pride, and a kind of tension you could feel in your chest before the doors even opened. J.D. Vance arrived just after 8 a.m., long before the cameras. He didn't shake hands. He didn't speak to the press. He walked straight into the back office, a quiet room lined with black and white photos of men in coveralls and hard hats. Men who had built something that didn't exist anymore. He opened a plain manila folder. Inside were letters, dozens of them, some handwritten in shaky ink, others typed in all caps like someone pounding every word through an aging keyboard. They came from Kentucky, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, even as far as Oregon. Each one a voice, each one a scar. I taught my son how to weld. He got replaced by a panel from overseas. My husband built wind turbines. Now we import them. They called it clean energy. It made our town disappear. J.D. read each one again, slowly, like the words weren't just meant to inform, but to anchor him. He tucked a few of them into a second folder, the one marked Debate Notes AOC, then zipped it shut. No slogans, no applause lines. Just the truth he planned to carry into the room. Outside, the line to enter had started forming around noon. They came in work boots and church shoes, in union jackets and campaign hats. Some carried signs. One read, "Don't call it justice if we're not in the room." Another, "Ask her about Xinjiang." At 2:30 p.m., AOC's motorcade pulled into the lot. Polished, efficient, flanked by local staffers and national advisors. She stepped out calmly, smiled once at the crowd, then entered without comment. The hall filled by 4 p.m., every seat taken. Cameras mounted, microphones checked twice. A moderator stood by with a clipboard and a look that said he wasn't sure whether he was here for a policy discussion or a political reckoning. J.D. stood backstage, still holding the folder. One of his aides whispered, "You ready?" He didn't answer right away. He looked through the side curtain at the audience. Tired eyes, folded arms, expectant silence. Then he said quietly, almost to himself, "They deserve to hear it, all of it." As the moderator walked to center stage and the lights dimmed slightly, the energy shifted. Not theatrical, solemn, like something was about to be weighed. Not votes, not approval ratings. Truth, and what it cost to say it out loud. The moderator stepped forward as the crowd settled into a thick, anticipatory hush. The only sound was the gentle hum of a camera panning across the stage. A woman in the front row adjusted her hearing aid. A teenager behind her gripped a notebook tightly, eyes wide. You could feel the room bracing. "Welcome to the Youngstown Climate Justice Town Hall." The phrase itself felt heavy, almost ironic. In a town that had watched justice pack its bags long ago, the idea of climate justice still sat like a bruise that hadn't healed. The moderator gestured toward the podium on the left. "Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, you may begin." AOC took the stage with ease. Confident, poised, crisp navy blazer. She didn't look around. She looked forward, straight into the camera. Her team had prepped her well, and she opened exactly as expected, with numbers. In the past 6 years, global solar output has risen by over 270%. That's not a trend. That's a transformation. Countries across Asia and Europe have made massive strides in manufacturing capacity, installation, and affordability. And America must stay competitive. A screen lit up behind her. Graphs, percentages, heat maps. Applause came, but it was mostly from the back of the hall. National reporters, visiting environmental advocates, a few students. She continued, "We can't afford to slow down. The climate crisis doesn't wait for us to perfect the system. It demands bold action, and that includes working with every willing nation, even imperfect ones, to transition globally. There it was, the veiled defense of her earlier remarks in Paris. Carefully worded, strategically ambiguous. J.D. Vance didn't move. He stood at his podium, hands folded, expression unreadable. AOC pivoted to domestic policy. Tax incentives, clean energy jobs, public-private partnerships. The language was polished, the delivery seamless. She was doing what she did best, driving narrative with confidence. We talk about loss, she said, but what about the lives saved by cleaner air, by long-term investment, by progress we can measure in degrees and decades? Polite applause followed, this time from both ends of the room. Not enthusiastic, just polite. Then the moderator nodded toward the right. Senator Vance, your response. J.D. didn't reach for notes. He didn't look at the screen. He waited 5 full seconds before he spoke, long enough for someone in the audience to shift in their chair. I appreciate the Congresswoman's numbers. He paused. I just wonder how many of those solar panels were built by free people. Silence. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't loud, but it cut through every graph on the wall behind her. The crowd didn't gasp. They froze. J.D. stepped forward slightly, voice calm but rooted. We're shown clean output, global stats, but we're not shown the footage of workers in Xinjiang under surveillance, or of American workers watching their plants close because we imported cheap progress with no questions asked. AOC shifted at the podium, not flustered, tired, but focused, listening. We talk about green jobs, J.D. continued. We had them in Kentucky, in Michigan, in West Virginia, until they were priced out by companies who don't care what freedom costs. He let the words sit. If that's what we call a model, then we've stopped measuring by values. We're just measuring volume. The audience stayed silent, not hostile, just tense. One of the moderators blinked, caught off guard by the pivot. AOC adjusted her mic slightly, waiting for her turn, but the tone of the room had already shifted. J.D. Vance stepped back. He didn't need to raise his voice. The question had been asked, and now the silence had to carry it. The moderator barely had time to reset when J.D. stepped forward again, this time with a small black binder tucked under his arm. He didn't raise it dramatically. He didn't announce what was inside. He simply placed it gently on the podium, opened it, and began flipping pages as if he were walking through a memory. I'd like to enter something into this discussion, he said evenly. He turned to the audience. This is a 2024 Amnesty International report. Title, Sunlight and Shadows, Forced Labor in the Global Solar Supply Chain. He held it up for just a moment. The camera zoomed in on the cover. Stark white, plain text. The kind of report most people never read unless they had to. It documents widespread labor violations in Xinjiang, China, including forced labor tied directly to polysilicon production used in solar panels. Panels that end up in European markets, in American homes, in government buildings. He flipped to a marked page. Quote, there is credible evidence that components sourced from Xinjiang are being used in solar manufacturing through programs that compel labor under state surveillance, with restricted movement and without informed consent. J.D. let that linger. He didn't read it again. He didn't need to. Now let me show you something else. From a second folder, he pulled a photo. It wasn't graphic, just haunting. A row of workers in identical uniforms, eyes down, in front of a massive industrial panel machine. No smiles, no names, no context. These are the hands building the panels we call green. He looked directly at AOC for the first time. And this, he said, voice tightening just slightly, is what we called a model of commitment. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Not loud, not coordinated, just discomfort given sound. AOC adjusted her mic. Senator Vance, she began, voice measured, this is a serious issue, and I agree that human rights violations must be addressed, but... She paused, searching, then finished. But that's not our responsibility directly. It was an answer, but not the kind the room was ready for. JD didn't flinch. He just nodded, the way someone does when they've been waiting for a sentence to land wrong. "We fund it," he said quietly. "We import it. We install it. We wear the label climate leader, and then we look the other way. That doesn't make it less ours. It makes it entirely ours." Silence again. Not from shock this time, from reflection. He took a breath. "And while we're doing that, while we're justifying this in the name of urgency, towns like this one lose their jobs, their pride, and their reason to believe anything coming out of Washington is said in good faith." He held up another letter from the folder, this one handwritten, folded at the corners, from a laid-off worker in Pennsylvania. "They say the future is coming. Well, it skipped us, and then it sent a bill." JD paused, his tone softening, not in weakness, but in gravity. "So maybe we ask a different question tonight. Not just what's being built, but who's paying for it, and not in money, but in silence, in jobs, and in dignity." AOC stood still. The moderator didn't interject. The cameras kept rolling. Outside the Union Hall, the sun had begun to fall behind the smokestack skyline, casting long shadows through dusty windows. Inside, no one moved, because in that moment, the debate was no longer about energy. It was about cost. The hall was still caught in that quiet, thick, full of thought, when JD looked back toward the audience. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't gesture. He just spoke into the stillness like someone who didn't come to win a point, but to leave a mark. "You can't call it progress if it buries the people you forgot to fight for." That was it. One sentence. It didn't come with music. No lights flickered, no dramatic pause. But in that moment, something broke open. A man in the third row stood, not to speak, just to stand. Then someone clapped, then someone else. And then, like a delayed current running through the room, the hall erupted. It wasn't polite applause. It wasn't partisan. It was a release. Even those who'd come wearing green campaign buttons found themselves hesitating, their hands halfway to the next clap, unsure what to do with what they'd just felt. Because JD hadn't delivered a policy line. He'd drawn a line in the soul. AOC stayed composed, but her face had tightened. Not in anger, not in embarrassment, just the way a person looks when they realize the room has shifted. And they weren't the one who shifted it. The moderator tried to speak, but his voice was drowned out by the last echoes of the applause. The cameras caught it all. The rise, the faces, the shift. Someone from a live stream feed clipped the quote and posted it before the moderator even finished the next sentence. "You can't call it progress if it buries the people you forgot to fight for." 28 words. That's all it took. The clip went up on YouTube before the event ended. TikTok cut it to 11 seconds and layered soft piano under it. By midnight, it had 500,000 views. By morning, it was on Fox News, CNN, MSNBC, and hashtag Forgotten to Fight for was trending nationwide. Fox News titled it, "JD Vance delivers the line that stops the left cold." CNN posted it under, "Vance challenges cost of climate push and emotional exchange." TikTok gave it something simpler. "When someone finally says what your town has been screaming for 10 years. In barber shops in Michigan, the clip played on someone's phone between shaves. In a diner in Indiana, it looped above the register. A high school civics teacher in Missouri assigned it for discussion. And in Brooklyn, AOC's team met behind closed doors, phones buzzing with coverage alerts, while a press secretary read the quote aloud again, this time much slower. JD Vance, for his part, didn't tweet it. He didn't retweet it either. He left the hall without comment, folded the folder of letters under his arm, and stepped into a car waiting just beyond the crowd. A reporter tried to catch him as the door closed. "Senator Vance, was that line planned?" JD paused, one hand on the doorframe. "No," he said. "That one came from home." Then he stepped in. The door closed. The taillights disappeared down a narrow side street lined with shuttered buildings and silent windows. And the rest of the country, still arguing over graphs and goals, was left with one question echoing louder than the rest. Who exactly are we leaving behind when we call it progress? The morning after the debate, Washington buzzed louder than usual, but not about legislation, not about bills or budgets. It was about the clip. J.D. Vance's line had cut through the noise, and for the first time in months, the headlines weren't about partisanship or polling. They were about something else entirely, a reckoning with the cost of so-called progress. But just as the public conversation began to deepen, something unexpected cracked it open wider. At 10:43 a.m., an article dropped on the Federal Lens, a conservative digital outlet known for its investigations, and occasionally for lighting political fires others weren't ready to touch. Headline: Exclusive. AOC's Paris handshake with CEO tied to Chinese surveillance and forced labor. Beneath it, a single photo. Grainy but unmistakable, AOC posts speech at the Global Sustainability Forum in Paris, extending her hand to a tall man in a gray suit. He wore no name tag, no visible credentials, but his face was clear. Yao Wen, CEO of Solentech International. The piece was thorough. It linked Yao to an ongoing U.S. intelligence probe into Solentech's use of forced labor through secondary suppliers in Xinjiang, and more alarmingly, to allegations of covert data harvesting partnerships with Chinese state agencies under the guise of renewable infrastructure deployment. None of it was brand new to those who monitored such reports, but the handshake was. The image, context, and timing made it combustible. J.D. Vance didn't call a press conference. He didn't go on TV. He simply quote tweeted the article, adding just 6 words: "When principles meet profit." Picture it. The post caught fire. Within the hour, #picture it was trending. News outlets scrambled to verify the image. Photographers tried to find the original source. Analysts dissected the body language in the handshake, the intent behind the eye contact, even the subtle placement of AOC's thumb. Her team released a short statement mid-afternoon. Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez meets with hundreds of individuals at global events. She was not aware of Mr. Yao's background at the time of this photo and does not endorse the practices of any company under investigation. But it didn't slow the storm. On cable news, the talking points sharpened. Fox ran a split screen. The photo on one side, a steelworker's abandoned helmet on the other. CNN invited former trade officials to explain Solentech's role in undercutting domestic solar manufacturers. MSNBC aired a segment defending AOC's climate diplomacy, but even their panelists admitted the optics were difficult. In the Midwest, the backlash wasn't measured in minutes of airtime. It was in conversations over lunch counters, in VFW halls, in pickup trucks outside silent plants. For towns that already felt sold out, this wasn't a scandal. It was confirmation. In Ohio, J.D. sat in his Senate office quietly watching the story evolve. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't celebrating. He was rereading the letters, the ones he hadn't shared on stage. His aide knocked once and entered with a tablet. "We've got requests pouring in. Media wants you back on camera. All the networks, even the Sunday shows." J.D. shook his head. "Not yet. Let the picture speak first." He turned the tablet back around, showing the photo again. 2 hands, 1 smile, no words, but everything said. The aide hesitated. "You think this is the one that sticks?" J.D. looked out the window, past the Capitol dome. "No," he said softly. "This is the one that sinks." By noon the next day, the photo had already been published in 3 national newspapers and clipped into more than 100 political reels. Cable segments dissected it like it was a classified document. TikTok turned it into satire. Subreddits turned it into suspicion. The image didn't scream scandal. It whispered something colder: complicity without awareness. AOC's office moved quickly. Their official statement, released across all major platforms, read, "The Congresswoman meets with hundreds of individuals at international forums and diplomatic events. She was unaware of Mr. Yao's executive role at Solentech at the time the photo was taken. This image is being intentionally misused in bad faith." The follow-up press briefing was short and controlled. Her press secretary didn't allow questions. He repeated the line: "Unaware, misused, taken out of context." The media room scribbled. The spin had begun. Legacy outlets followed suit. Not with outright defense, but with gentle redirection. The New York Standard ran the headline, "One frame, big reactions, why the Paris photo isn't what it seems." MSNBC brought on a climate analyst who framed the moment as an unfortunate byproduct of global diplomacy. CNN focused instead on J.D. Vance's rising digital momentum and what it means for populist messaging. Even Politico called it a distraction from the broader climate urgency. But outside the polished studios, the tone was different. The comment sections beneath the headlines were ruthless. Union members, veterans, small-town organizers, and laid-off solar techs flooded them with questions. Not just about the handshake, but about what it represented. If you don't know who you're shaking hands with, why are you speaking for us? She didn't have time to vet him, but she had time to praise the country that funds him. You don't get to call it leadership if you can't recognize the cost. Through it all, JD said nothing. No new tweets, no press release, no interviews. He didn't retreat. He waited. And the silence was louder than any headline. His team fielded dozens of requests from major networks, all eager to get him back on screen. His aides debated which platform would offer the best optics. One suggested a Sunday sit-down. Another pitched a live press conference near a shuttered plant. JD declined every option. "Let it breathe," he said simply. Instead, he read letters, reports, articles both flattering and furious. He watched the public digest the image in real time, not reactively, but slowly, like something sinking deeper the more people stared at it. His only move was subtle. He changed the banner photo on his Senate website to a wide shot of a steel mill at sunset. No tagline, no headline. Just the silhouette of smokestacks that hadn't billowed in 15 years, washed in orange and memory. For now, that was his only statement, because he understood something Washington often forgot. Not all silence is weakness. Sometimes silence is strategy, and sometimes it's the only sound that tells the truth louder than words. 3 days after the photo leaked, the Senate Committee on Energy and Public Responsibility issued the summons. It wasn't a subpoena. Not yet, but it might as well have been. The wording was firm. The committee requests testimony from Senator J.D. Vance and Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez on the ethical implications of international climate partnerships and their impact on domestic labor. The announcement hit cable news mid-morning. By noon, it had gone national. The networks labeled it everything from the climate clash to Paris fallout, round 2. Headlines spun fast. But for JD, the noise didn't matter. His focus was already elsewhere. Because even before the announcement went public, the letters had started to arrive. Not from donors, not from strategists or lobbyists. These came from long-haul truckers in Tennessee, from factory workers in Indiana, from coal families in Pennsylvania. Handwritten, typed, scrawled in pencil and permanent marker. Folded in half, sealed with tape, slipped into manila envelopes. Some came by mail, others by email. Some had no return address. One simply said, "Don't let them call us invisible again." Another, "I lost my job to Green Progress. I haven't paid my mortgage in 3 months. I watched you on stage. You look like someone who might still remember what that feels like." JD sat at his desk in silence, reading them one by one. There was no strategy meeting, no war room, just a growing pile of voices, raw, plain, unscripted, stacked on his desk like proof of something Washington didn't want to see. Across the aisle, AOC's team confirmed her attendance at the hearing with a brisk 2-line statement. Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez welcomes the opportunity to speak before the committee and clarify the broader importance of international climate cooperation. The contrast was hard to miss. As the date was finalized and reporters circled like sharks, JD still hadn't spoken publicly, but he began carrying one of the letters in his breast pocket, the first one he'd received. A note from a retired steelworker in Akron who'd lost his pension when the plant folded. The final line read, "You asked the question no one else would. Don't stop now." The night before the hearing, JD stood alone in his office. The city outside was buzzing, glowing, distracted. But inside it was quiet. On the wall hung a framed printout of the amnesty report. Beneath it, pinned to corkboard, was the Paris photo. Below that, just the handwritten line, torn from a note, "Don't let them call us invisible again." He reached up, adjusted the pin holding the note in place, then turned out the lights. He didn't need prep memos. He didn't need polling. He had something else, weight. Not in words, but in stories. Not in data, but in lived consequences. And he knew exactly what to bring to the hearing. Not outrage, not performance. A reminder that behind every Green Deal and every handshake, there are names, faces, whole towns whose silence was never consent. The Senate hearing room was colder than it looked on camera. The lighting was clinical, the air overly chilled, and the faces lining the back rows too still. Hill staffers, media aides, silent press. The dais stretched wide with the Energy and Public Responsibility Committee seated in measured formation. Senators on both sides of the aisle shuffled notes, exchanged glances, and checked screens. At the center, the two figures everyone had come to see sat exactly as expected. Firm, composed, unblinking. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, in a slate gray suit, her hands folded neatly on the table. Senator J.D. Vance in dark navy, the same steelworker's letter tucked into his breast pocket. The chair gavelled in at precisely 9 a.m., welcomed the witnesses, and motioned for the Congresswoman to begin her remarks. AOC stood. Her voice was calm, confident, practiced but not performative. She spoke without notes. Climate change is not a theory, it is a reality, and it's not coming. It's here. The floods in Vermont, the droughts in Texas, the wildfires in California. These aren't hypotheticals. They are symptoms of a crisis we have too long debated while others have acted. Cameras clicked. Our work must include global partnerships, not because we trust every partner blindly, but because the scale of the challenge demands cooperation beyond borders. She turned slightly toward the committee. No country is perfect, but China, for all its flaws, has made historic investments in renewable capacity. Solar, wind, storage. They're building while we're still arguing. We cannot let fear dictate our future. There it was, the pivot, polished and deliberate. Let me be clear. I do not endorse any nation's human rights abuses, but I reject the false choice between progress and purity. Climate justice must be global, and it must move forward, even if the world we move through is imperfect. She sat down to light applause from a few committee members. Several nodded approvingly. J.D. Vance did not move. He hadn't written a word. His pen sat untouched on the table. The chair turned toward him. Senator Vance, your opening remarks. J.D. looked ahead, not at AOC, not at the cameras, but at the rows of people in the public gallery. Many of them weren't journalists or lobbyists. They were steelworkers, miners, truckers, and union retirees who had traveled overnight to be in that room. He spoke quietly. I'm not here to attack, he said. I'm here to ask. The room paused. That line wasn't on any prep sheet. J.D. leaned forward, voice steady. Ask who gets remembered when we call something progress. Ask who we shook hands with while our workers packed their lockers. Ask who builds our panels, who loses their pensions, who signs the bills, and who pays them. He tapped a finger gently on the folder before him. I've read over 200 letters in the past week, from Americans who believed in the clean energy future. They trained for it. They gave years to it. And then they were undercut by companies that don't play by the rules, but got welcomed to the table anyway. No one interrupted. If we're going to talk about climate justice, then we must also talk about labor justice, national dignity, economic sovereignty. We must talk about the millions who are never in the room when the deals are made, but always pay the price when they fall apart. He paused, not for effect, but because it mattered. I'm not against clean energy. I'm against forgetting who we were supposed to build it for. He closed the folder, folded his hands, and waited. The room did not applaud. It didn't need to, because silence, when earned, says more than applause ever can. J.D. didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. With his hands calmly folded atop the folder of letters, he looked down, flipped a tab, and pulled out a single sheet. The lighting overhead caught its glossy edge. Not a letter this time, but a government spreadsheet. This is U.S. Customs and Border Protection import data from Q4 last year, he began. It shows a 37% increase in imported solar panel components from Xinjiang province, China, during the same quarter that 3 American solar plants filed bankruptcy notices. He placed the sheet on the table face up, letting the silence read it along with him. That same report cross-references several shipments flagged under the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, but not a single one was denied entry, not one. A few committee members shifted in their seats. So we're not just turning a blind eye, we're waving it through. We're importing solar parts faster than ever, while communities like Hazard, Kentucky, and Allenville, Ohio, are watching their last paychecks walk out the door. He flipped to another tab, this time a color-coded chart. This one tracks closures. Clean energy factories in the U.S. shuttered in the past 5 years, 32 in total. Most in towns where the median income was already below national average. Most promised federal support, most received none. Still no response from AOC. Still no interjection from the chair. And then JD reached for the letter. It was handwritten in blue ink on wide-ruled paper. Folded in half, creased at the edges. This one came from a 12-year-old girl in Pennsylvania, he said. Her father worked at a clean energy glass facility until they cut 70% of their workforce after losing a contract to a Chinese supplier. He cleared his throat slightly and read. Voice quiet but firm. My dad stopped coming home with dirt on his hands. Now he just comes home tired. I heard him tell my mom, I guess I wasn't made for the future. But he was. He was made for this one. JD paused. The only sound in the room was the soft whir of a camera adjusting focus. Then he looked up, directly at AOC. Representative Ocasio-Cortez, he said, steady and direct. You called China a model. You said we must work with them. You said we can't let fear slow us down. The silence leaned forward. But if they are the model, who protects the people who still believe in ours? There it was. No accusation, no insult. Just the kind of question that doesn't need to be answered to be heard, because everyone in the room already felt the weight of it. A long beat passed. AOC blinked once. Her lips parted as if to speak, but nothing came out. The chair, sensing the shift in air, reached for his gavel, then hesitated. In the gallery, someone, no one knows who, whispered aloud, not loud enough to be disruptive, but loud enough to echo in a room listening too hard. That one's gonna stay with her. Cameras clicked. A reporter looked down at their screen, deleting the sentence they'd written moments earlier, because the story had just changed. Not with a headline, not with a poll, but with a question that didn't just land, it thundered. For a full second, nothing moved. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sat straight in her seat, eyes fixed forward, mouth slightly open, as if the response had formed but refused to surface. Her hands, folded neatly seconds ago, began to shift, one thumb nervously tracing the edge of her index finger. The papers before her remained untouched. The cameras didn't cut away. They held. Second 2, second 3. A senator coughed softly into his elbow, more out of instinct than necessity. Second 4, a man in the back row, flannel shirt, arms crossed, leaned forward slightly, narrowing his gaze like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Second 5. On the live stream, chat comments paused. Reporters stopped typing. Analysts waited, eyes wide, notes frozen mid-sentence. Second 6. AOC blinked once, slow and deliberate, as if trying to ground herself in a room that had suddenly gone off script. Second 7. No rebuttal, no pivot, just the sound of breathing, creaking chairs, and a silence so full it had become deafening. Second 8. The committee chair shifted in his seat, adjusting his glasses, clearly debating whether to intervene. And then, second 9. He cleared his throat, not loudly, not impatiently, just enough to signal that time had passed, that something had broken, but the silence still held. And that's when the camera, unmanned, pre-programmed, and mercilessly timed, slowly panned back to J.D. Vance. He hadn't moved. He hadn't blinked. He wasn't gloating. He looked, in that moment, like every man who had stood quietly at the edge of a town hall, waiting to speak for the first time in 20 years. Then, barely above a whisper, he spoke into the microphone. That's what it feels like when no one answers your town. No one clapped, no one spoke. The words didn't crash like thunder. They sank, and the sinking felt slower than gravity should allow. Across the nation, clips of that exact moment began uploading within minutes. TikTok loops of the 9-second pause. YouTube compilations with time counters in the corner. Cable news channels showing it uninterrupted. 9 full seconds of dead air that said more than 9 interviews ever could. Commentators tried to explain it. Pundits tried to reframe it. But the public already understood. This wasn't a debate. It had become something else. In the Midwest, a woman replayed the clip in her kitchen and said out loud to no one, "That's us." In Detroit, a retired machinist shared it with his son and wrote, "This is what I've been trying to say." In Houston, a high school government teacher asked her students, "What does it mean to be answered?" And on Capitol Hill, aides scrambled to manage optics while one by one, committee members sat back in their chairs, realizing that they had just witnessed a political moment that would outlast their memos. J.D. Vance didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. The room finally moved on, but the silence didn't leave with it. It stayed, hung in the air. And for those who had spent years shouting into it, that silence had finally spoken back. The clip hadn't even cooled on the servers before the headlines arrived, sharp and divided. CNN framed it as a missed opportunity for unity. Fox News ran a banner that simply read, "He asked what we all felt." MSNBC debated whether JD's question was brilliant populism or dangerous oversimplification. In the first 24 hours, no less than 89 media op-eds tried to unpack what had happened in those 9 seconds. Some called it a masterclass in restraint. Others accused J.D. Vance of exploiting silence as a weapon. But amid the media thunderstorm, something quieter and far more powerful began to unfold. The comments didn't come from pundits. They came from people. On Facebook, a former GM worker in Michigan wrote, "He didn't sound like a senator. He sounded like my cousin at the bar." A school custodian in Pennsylvania sent an email to JD's public account. It read, "You didn't say it pretty. You said it plain. That's why it hit. Thank you." Another note came in from a retired Navy vet in Indiana. Subject line, 9 seconds. The body simply said, "That's how long we waited every day before someone decided our town didn't matter anymore." In a union hall in West Virginia, someone printed JD's quote and taped it to the break room fridge. That's what it feels like when no one answers your town. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't rehearsed. That was the point. The storm of coverage only amplified the echo. For every think piece dissecting JD's words, 10 more comments from workers, veterans, teachers, and janitors poured in. It wasn't that they agreed with every position he held. It was that, for the first time in a long time, they saw someone ask a question no one had dared to ask with cameras rolling. In Washington, some colleagues bristled. AOC's camp accused JD of exploiting emotion and misdirecting blame. A campaign consultant went on air and said, "This isn't courage, it's manipulation in a flannel suit." But JD didn't reply. Not yet. Instead, he spent that night alone in his office, reading through printed letters from Americans who'd been laid off in the last 5 years. A quiet stack, no lobbying language, no flashy fonts, just ink and pain. As the noise swirled around him, he highlighted one line from a woman in Kentucky. "They sent our jobs overseas and called it progress. You just called it what it was." The media was still arguing. The country had already chosen its moment. At 2:17 a.m., JD finally posted something to his personal feed. No commentary, no photo, just a single sentence. "If it sounded like your story, maybe that's because it was." In Youngstown, the Union Hall where he had prepped for the first debate lit up with laughter and nods when someone read it aloud. The storm was far from over, but the echo, it was real, and it was growing. It came in a plain white envelope, postmarked from Logan County, West Virginia. No return address, just JD's name in sharp slanted handwriting and a small corner of the envelope smudged, as if it had been carried in someone's back pocket for days before finally being mailed. His staff had stacked it with dozens of others, but something about the ink, real ink, not printer toner, caught JD's eye. He opened it slowly, carefully folding the crease so the letter inside wouldn't tear. The note was written on lined notebook paper. The words, uneven and raw, began. I've never voted. I don't even know if I want to. But when you talked about my dad's job, I felt like someone saw us. Really saw us. JD's eyes hovered on that sentence longer than he expected. The letter continued, hesitating at times, unsure in its phrasing, but entirely certain in feeling. He worked in the mines for 20 years. When they shut down, he stopped talking at dinner. Now he works night shift at a gas station. He doesn't say much, but when your clip came on TV, he looked at me and said, "That guy remembers." I don't know what I'm supposed to believe in, but I believe that. It was signed, Evan, 17, Logan High School. Then in the corner, my mom says to tell you she voted for the other side, but she liked your question. JD sat back in his chair, the edges of the letter still trembling in his hands. The office around him, lined with muted lights and half-drunk coffee mugs, seemed to go quiet. This wasn't a campaign note. It wasn't a press packet. It wasn't data. It was what they kept forgetting in Washington. A voice that didn't know how to scream, but still deserved to be heard. On a small wooden shelf behind his desk sat 3 items he rarely touched. A folded American flag given to his office by the widow of a Kentucky steelworker who died waiting for his pension to arrive. A worn coal miner's helmet donated by the son of a retired worker who used to whistle hymns during 12-hour shifts underground. And a blank space between them, until now. JD stood, walked over, and placed Evan's letter in that empty space. He didn't put it in a frame. He didn't laminate it. He just smoothed the paper flat, as if honoring its wrinkles gave it more truth. For a long moment, he stared at that small collection. Not relics, not symbols. Stories carried in sweat, loss, and now, finally, acknowledgement. Later that night, a colleague asked him if he was planning a response to the media backlash, still swirling from the hearing. JD nodded, but he didn't pull out a statement or a press strategy. He picked up a pen and wrote one sentence on a sticky note. For Evan. For the ones who still wait for someone to see them. Then he placed that note under the letter. In West Virginia, a 17-year-old kid had decided that feeling seen might just be enough reason to start believing again. And in a quiet Senate office in D.C., a grown man who'd once lost faith in Washington found something worth protecting again. Not with noise, but with remembrance. The debate had sparked headlines. But the letter sparked something far more difficult to measure. Trust. The letter from Evan stayed on JD's desk for days. Not in a drawer, not in a file. Right there beside the phone and under the light. When the Senate calendar cleared on a Thursday morning, he didn't alert the press or draft a tweet. He grabbed his jacket, nodded to his staff, and walked out. By afternoon, he was in East Ohio. The steel mill on the edge of Mahoning County had once been written off, its name quietly removed from state development memos, its perimeter chained like an abandoned outpost. But 6 months after the energy hearings and public pressure campaign, the plant had begun its slow return. Not flashy, not fully staffed, but breathing. JD didn't call ahead. When he arrived, the gate guard didn't flinch, just raised a brow and asked, "You here for the tour or the work?" JD smiled, removed his jacket, and said, "Neither. Just here to listen." Inside, the hum of machines was back, though not yet full throttle. A dozen men and women in hard hats worked the line, welding steel beams under fluorescent lights that still flickered at the edges. No cameras, no crew. JD walked with his sleeves rolled up and his tie loose. He stopped at each section, not to inspect, but to talk, really talk. One man, grease on his collar and a welding mask slung on his shoulder, nodded when JD approached, but didn't smile. He said, "Last time a politician came in here, we were 3 weeks from pink slips." JD didn't offer reassurance. He just asked, "What's different now?" The man pointed to a plaque newly bolted near the entrance. A simple inscription, reopened by Section 34 of the Domestic Supply Act. It was the bill JD had co-sponsored after the hearing. He paused, then said something quieter. "This time, it feels like someone fought for us. Not just for the press release, for real." JD took a long breath. That sentence didn't belong in a headline. It belonged here, between the blast furnace and the break room, and in that moment, it was worth more than any viral clip. Further down the line, a young woman, barely out of high school by the look of her, asked, "Are you the guy from the TV clip? The one with the coal helmet in his office?" He laughed. "I'm the guy with a long memory and a short fuse for excuses." She grinned. "That'll do." By late afternoon, JD stood near the back bay doors, the smell of iron and heat still clinging to his clothes. He looked out toward the train tracks behind the plant, the same ones that had carried freight and memories out of town for decades. But today the tracks weren't empty. A fresh shipment of American milled steel was being loaded. No applause, no ceremony, just work. As he turned to leave, one of the workers, an older man with a limp and a grip like iron, extended a hand. "Most of us thought we were done," he said, "but you didn't speak to save a job. You spoke so we'd remember we were never obsolete in the first place." JD shook his hand. Firmly, silently. Back in the car, he didn't reach for his phone. He just sat there, window cracked, as the low hum of the mill filled the air behind him. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't finished, but it was real. And sometimes the quietest visits are the ones that say the most. The morning after returning from the mill, J.D. Vance stepped into his Senate office before the aides arrived. The city was still half asleep, the Capitol dome barely glowing in the gray wash of pre-dawn light. He carried no briefing folder, no speech notes, just two items held carefully in his hands. One was the printed transcript of the Senate energy hearing, the full exchange including those 9 seconds of silence. The other was Evan's letter, the one scrawled in slanted handwriting on ruled notebook paper, folded neatly, still holding the scent of wood smoke and ink. He laid them both on his desk. The room was quiet, just the tick of a wall clock and the distant sound of a cleaning crew down the hall. He ran his fingers across the paper. The transcript was official, neatly typed, sourced, stamped with the congressional seal. The letter was imperfect, creases, smudges, and a blue ink blot in the corner where Evan had pressed too hard with the pen. And yet both told the same story, not of policy, but of people. By noon, a local craftsman from Ohio had arrived, someone JD had used before for woodwork back home. They talked quietly, and JD pointed to the wall behind his desk. "I want them side by side," he said. "Same frame, no hierarchy." The man nodded. He understood. 3 days later, the frame was mounted. A long rectangle of walnut, deep-grained and polished just enough to catch the morning light. On the left, the printed debate transcript, beginning with JD's opening line, "I'm not here to attack. I'm here to ask." On the right, Evan's letter, now pressed under archival glass, but still entirely legible. Beneath both, carved into the wood by hand in block serif. "We weren't asking for praise, just to not be forgotten." Staffers who entered his office would often pause in front of it. No one spoke much about it, but some would linger a moment longer before continuing their day. It wasn't meant to be a centerpiece. It wasn't a campaign prop. It was a promise, in frame and form, that the conversation that began in Youngstown didn't end when the lights went out. One morning, a visiting policy intern from North Carolina asked if she could read the letter. JD nodded. She did, slowly. When she was done, she whispered, "I didn't think people still wrote like this." JD smiled faintly. "They do, when someone finally listens." From then on, he never sat at his desk without that frame in his eyeline. Not because it gave him answers, but because it reminded him of the only question that mattered. Are they still invisible? Outside, the city moved as always. Bills, speeches, headlines. But inside that room, carved into grain and paper, something stayed still. A pause. A name. A memory. Not to be praised, just not to be erased. A week after the hearing, in a small public high school outside Scranton, Pennsylvania, a civics teacher named Mr. Lanier dimmed the lights and queued up the clip. His classroom wasn't fancy, just faded posters of the Constitution, a flag tucked in the corner, and rows of slightly wobbly desks. But today's lesson felt different. The projector cast J.D. Vance's face onto the wall. The moment played back in full, the firm voice, the paper in hand, the 9 seconds of silence, and then, that's what it feels like when no one answers your town. A few students shifted in their seats. Some stared straight ahead, eyes narrowed, absorbing every word. Others just listened, arms crossed, uncertain what to make of it all. The room was quiet long after the clip ended. It lingered in the air, the kind of silence that didn't ask to be broken, just understood. Then a girl in the back raised her hand. "Did he win?" she asked. Mr. Lanier looked up, caught off guard. He leaned against the front desk, crossing his arms, and glanced toward the screen that now showed only the frozen image of JD's final line. "That's a good question," he said slowly. "But maybe the better question is, who's still listening now?" The students glanced at each other, unsure. He continued, "You know, debates usually have winners and losers. That's the game. But sometimes the real win is what echoes after the cameras stop rolling." He turned off the projector. JD didn't shout. He didn't accuse. He just asked one thing. Who speaks for the towns that nobody writes about anymore? And whether you agree with him or not, you can't ignore what that question did. A boy near the window spoke up, hesitant. It felt like he wasn't trying to be a politician. He wasn't, Mr. Lanier nodded. Not in that moment. He was being something a lot rarer. A neighbor? The teacher smiled. Exactly. A neighbor who remembered. The bell rang, sharp and sudden, scattering the spell. Backpacks zipped, chairs scraped, and the hallway buzzed to life. But a few students lingered for just a second longer. One paused at the door, then turned back. "Will we talk more about this next week?" Mr. Lanier nodded. "Yes, because stories like that don't end in one clip." Outside, snow was beginning to fall. Quiet, steady, unnoticed by most. But inside that classroom, a question still hung in the air. Not about climate or trade or power, but about voice. About who gets heard and who doesn't. And for once, in that room at least, someone had listened. The sun was setting behind the ridge when J.D. Vance unfolded the last letter of the day. His office, now quiet, was dimly lit with only the warm hum of the desk lamp, casting soft shadows across the framed letter and transcript on the wall. The voices from the civics classroom in Pennsylvania hadn't reached him directly, but their echo lingered in spirit, in every envelope that still found its way to this room. This letter was from a retired machinist in Indiana. Short, handwritten, no punctuation in places, just raw, unpolished truth. "I don't know policy, but I know what it's like when the plant closes and your name gets called at 6 a.m. to pick up your last check. I saw that clip. You made us feel like we weren't left behind this time." JD didn't read it twice. He didn't have to. He placed the note gently beside the others, as if joining them into a quiet archive of voices that mattered. Then he stood, walking slowly toward the window that overlooked the Potomac, the lights of Washington flickering beneath the blue dusk. His reflection hovered in the glass, but his eyes were far beyond the city, drawn back to the steel halls, the shuttered plants, the schoolroom still asking questions. He didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. Some words are too large to carry in sound. Some answers don't arrive in hearings or headlines. And some truths, the ones that stay, don't need to be shouted. They just need someone willing to ask them plainly and let the silence say what it must. And in that silence, the story didn't end. It settled, it stayed, and that somehow was enough. This story reminds us that true leadership isn't always loud. It's often quiet, consistent, and deeply human. JD didn't seek applause. He sought understanding. And in doing so, he gave voice to those America too often forgets. It's a powerful reminder that asking the right question at the right time can echo longer than any answer. What about you? Have you ever felt unseen until someone finally spoke the truth out loud for people like you? If this story touches you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to JD Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching JD Stories.